Okay, so World War One. We all think we know the basic story, right? Like it all started with that Archduke guy getting shot, Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo.
Yeah, it's like that's History 101. Everyone remembers that moment.
Right. That's like the big bang moment that kicked off this whole global conflict. But here's the thing. I've been reading a lot about this lately, and I'm starting to think that maybe that assassination wasn't the whole story.
It's easy to fall into that trap, right? Like, oh, one event equals big war, but history is always way messier than that, especially when you're talking about something as massive as World War One.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today in this deep dive. It's not just about the battles and dates and stuff. It's about all the things they don't always teach you in school, the stuff that was happening behind closed doors, the real motives and the hidden stories that actually shaped the course of history. And I think this is going to be pretty eye-opening for a lot of our listeners because we're going to go way beyond those textbook explanations and really get into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, like think of it like this. We're basically like historical detectives uncovering the real story behind World War One.
Love that. All right, so let's start with that assassination. What do we actually know about it? I mean, besides the basic facts that everyone's heard a million times.
Well, the accepted version is that on June 28th, 1914, Gavrilo Princip, who was a Serbian nationalist, shot and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo.
Okay, but here's where it gets interesting for me. Like when you really dig into the details, it almost seems like Princip being there at that exact moment was kind of a fluke. Like he wasn't even supposed to be there. He was grabbing a bite to eat after an earlier assassination attempt had failed, right?
Exactly. There was a bomb thrown at the Archduke's car earlier that day, but it missed. And Princip had actually given up and gone to a cafe. It's total chance that he even ran into the Archduke's motorcade again later.
Talk about a wrong place, wrong time situation. So it wasn't like this meticulously planned hit that was destined to happen. And get this, the Black Hand, the Serbian group that Princip was part of, they almost called off the whole operation after that first attempt.
Imagine that. Like, well, that didn't work. Let's just go home.
But then, boom, history takes this random turn. And to make it even more complicated, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that Austria-Hungary might have been itching for a reason to go to war anyway.
Right, like they saw the assassination as this perfect excuse. They'd been wanting to expand their power in the Balkans for a while, and this gave them the justification they needed.
So it's like this whole domino effect. It wasn't just a simple cause and effect. There were all these other things bubbling under the surface, these tensions and rivalries that were just waiting to explode. And this assassination, this totally bizarre incident, just happened to be the trigger.
You're totally right. It was a catalyst. And what's fascinating is that it wasn't just about Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Like all the major European powers had these complex alliances with each other. So when one country got pulled into a conflict, it basically dragged everyone else in with them.
It's like a giant tangled web.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that even without the assassination, some kind of conflict might have been inevitable anyway, right?
Exactly. There are all these underlying tensions and rivalries just simmering below the surface. Europe was like a powder keg waiting for a spark.
Okay, so that's the assassination, the seemingly random event that set off this chain reaction.
Yeah.
But the thing that really gets me is that while this war is raging on, these world leaders are making all these secret deals and agreements behind the scenes.
It's like a whole other war was being fought in the shadows.
It is. And those deals had massive implications for the world we live in today, right? Like, for starters, there's the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. Think about this. Britain and France were fighting alongside their Arab allies against the Ottoman Empire, publicly promising them freedom and independence, but secretly, they were carving up the Middle East between themselves.
It was total betrayal, and they just drew lines on a map dividing up the region with no regard for the people who lived there or their cultural and historical ties.
I mean, talk about playing both sides. And that agreement basically set the stage for a lot of the conflicts and instability in the Middle East that we're still dealing with today.
Absolutely. The legacy of Sykes-Picot is still very much alive. And that's not the only example of secret wartime maneuvering. There's also the Zimmermann telegram from 1917. This was a German attempt to basically get Mexico to attack the United States.
Yeah, what? They actually tried to instigate a war between the U.S. and Mexico.
Yep. Germany was desperate. They were losing ground in Europe, and they knew that if the U.S. entered the war on the Allied side, it would be a huge blow to them. So they sent this telegram to Mexico, promising them that if they attacked the U.S., Germany would help them regain territories they had lost in the Mexican-American War, like Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico.
Wow. That's a bold move.
To say the least. And incredibly risky. Of course, the telegram was intercepted by the British and leaked to the American press. And guess what? That played a huge role in swaying American public opinion against Germany and ultimately led to the U.S. entering World War I.
So that's one secret deal that backfired spectacularly. And then there's the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918, which was a secret agreement between Germany and Bolshevik Russia.
Yeah, this one was all about survival. Russia was in the middle of a revolution and desperately needed to get out of the war. And Germany, even though they were on the winning side at that point, was also feeling the strain of the conflict.
So it was a deal born out of necessity.
Exactly. And Russia ended up paying a heavy price. They were forced to give up huge chunks of territory to Germany. But for them, it was a matter of staying afloat. They needed to end the war at any cost.
So when you look at all these secret agreements, it paints a much more complicated picture of World War I, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just about good guys versus bad guys. It was about power, strategy, and each nation trying to survive and come out on top.
Absolutely. And it shows just how much was going on behind the scenes that most people were totally unaware of at the time. And these deals had lasting effects on the world, effects that we're still living with today.
For sure. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the soldiers who were actually fighting this war.
Yeah.
Because when you think about it, the reality of what they went through in those trenches was a far cry from any kind of romanticized vision of war.
You're so right. The popular image of World War I is often these dashing soldiers charging across open fields, but the reality was incredibly brutal and horrific.
Yeah, and the conditions in those trenches were absolutely appalling. They were muddy, rat-infested, and constantly under bombardment. I mean, imagine being stuck in a ditch like that for months on end, never knowing when the next attack might come. It must have been a living nightmare.
Absolutely. And the fighting itself was unlike anything that had been seen before. With new technologies like machine guns and heavy artillery, the casualties were absolutely staggering.
And the thing that always gets to me is that it wasn't just the fighting that was so terrible. The conditions themselves were just as deadly. You had men literally drowning in the mud. And it wasn't just mud from the rain. It was mixed with, well, let's just say it was a truly gruesome mix.
Yeah, you're talking about decomposing bodies. The lack of sanitation in the trenches meant that disease was rampant, and the psychological toll on the soldiers from witnessing such constant death and suffering was immeasurable.
And then, on top of all that, you had the introduction of chemical weapons. Mustard gas, chlorine gas, these horrific weapons caused excruciating pain, blindness, and often a slow and agonizing death. It was a truly barbaric form of warfare.
It was, and it added a whole new level of terror to the battlefield. And what's truly disturbing is that there's a lot of evidence suggesting that war crimes were committed by both sides, things that were deliberately covered up after the war.
Yeah, we often hear about the atrocities committed by one side or the other, but the reality is that war brings out the worst in humanity. And no one side had a monopoly on brutality.
Exactly. The fog of war can lead to actions that would be unthinkable in peacetime, and that's something that's important to remember when we study history.
Right. It's so easy to get caught up in the narratives of good versus evil, but the truth is always far more complex. And when it comes to World War I, the soldiers who fought in the trenches experienced a level of horror that's almost unimaginable to us today. So it's important to remember their stories and the incredible sacrifices they made.
Absolutely. And to remember that their experiences were often very different from the stories that were being told back home. Because speaking of stories, let's talk about the role of propaganda and misinformation during World War I.
Right, because while these soldiers were fighting and dying in the trenches, back home governments were waging a whole different kind of war, a war of information. And they were using all sorts of tactics to control what their citizens knew and how they felt about the war.
Yeah, propaganda was a major tool for all the governments involved, and it's fascinating to see how they used it to demonize their enemies, boost morale, and ultimately keep the war effort going.
Okay, let's give our listeners some examples. There's the Rape of Belgium, which was a British propaganda campaign that focused on alleged German atrocities in Belgium at the start of the war. While there were certainly some instances of German soldiers committing crimes against civilians, the British press really played up these stories, often exaggerating them or even completely fabricating them to stir up anti-German sentiment.
It's a classic example of using fear and outrage to rally public support, and it worked. The stories about the Rape of Belgium really turned public opinion in Britain and the U.S. against Germany.
And then there's the sinking of the Lusitania, a British passenger liner that was torpedoed by a German U-boat in 1915. Over 1,000 people died, including 128 Americans, and this event really pushed the U.S. closer to war.
Right. And the way it was portrayed in the U.S. media was very much as an unprovoked attack on innocent civilians. But what wasn't widely publicized at the time was that the Lusitania was actually carrying a secret cargo of munitions bound for Britain.
So it wasn't as black and white as it was made out to be. And that's not all. Remember the over by Christmas myth.
Oh, absolutely. At the start of the war, a lot of people, including many of the soldiers themselves, thought it would all be over by Christmas of 1914.
Yeah, there was this widespread belief that it would be a short and decisive war. But obviously, that wasn't the case. The war dragged on for 4 long and bloody years.
And that myth was perpetuated by governments and the media to keep morale high and encourage enlistment. But in reality, it was just a tragic illusion.
So what's clear from all these examples is that the truth was often a casualty of war. And the governments involved were very good at manipulating information and shaping the narrative to suit their needs.
And that manipulation had a profound impact on the way the war was perceived and remembered. Even today, a lot of our understanding of World War I is shaped by the propaganda that was spread at the time.
Okay, so we've talked about the assassination, the secret deals, the horrific reality of trench warfare, and the role of propaganda. But what about the aftermath of the war? What kind of long-term consequences did this global conflict have on the world?
Well, even though the guns fell silent in 1918, the repercussions of World War I continued to be felt for decades and arguably still shape our world today.
Right, and probably one of the most significant consequences was the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in 1919.
Oh.
This is the treaty that officially ended the war and imposed incredibly harsh terms on Germany.
It was essentially a punishment for Germany. They were blamed for the war and forced to pay huge reparations, give up territory, and disarm their military.
And a lot of historians believe that this treaty actually helped to create the conditions that led to the rise of Nazism and the outbreak of World War II just 20 years later.
Exactly. It created resentment and instability in Germany. The German people felt humiliated and betrayed, and that created a breeding ground for extremist ideologies.
So it's like this tragic irony.
Yeah.
The treaty that was supposed to end all wars actually helped to pave the way for another, even more devastating conflict.
Yeah, the Treaty of Versailles is a prime example of how short-sighted and vengeful peace treaties can backfire spectacularly.
And it wasn't just Europe that was affected by the aftermath of World War I. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire had huge implications for the Middle East.
Absolutely. The Ottoman Empire had been this major power for centuries, and its disintegration led to the creation of new countries and the redrawing of borders in the Middle East, often with little regard for the ethnic and religious makeup of the region.
And that led to a lot of the conflicts and instability that we're still seeing in the Middle East today. It's like the ripples from World War I are still spreading out a century later.
And we can't forget about the impact on colonialism. While some empires collapsed after the war, others, like Britain and France, actually expanded their colonial holdings.
So while the war was supposedly fought for democracy and self-determination, it also led to the continuation and even expansion of colonial rule in many parts of the world. It's a real contradiction.
Yeah, it's a reminder that history is full of these complex and often contradictory outcomes. And it's why it's so important to dig deeper and look beyond the simple narratives.
So to wrap things up, I think it's safe to say that World War I was a far more complex and nuanced event than we often give it credit for. And its legacy is still being felt today in countless ways.
Absolutely. It was a truly global conflict that reshaped the world, and its impact is still being debated and analyzed by historians today.
And that's what makes history so fascinating, right? It's not just a bunch of dates and names. It's a story full of twists and turns, heroes and villains, and consequences that can echo through time.
And it's a story that's still being written, because the choices we make today are shaped by the events of the past, and they will in turn shape the future.
So it's up to us to learn from history, to understand its complexities, and to use that knowledge to build a better future. And that's why I think it's so important to keep digging deeper, to question the narratives we're given, and to always be curious about the world around us.
Because as we've seen today, the truth is often more interesting and more complicated than we might think.
And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the hidden history of World War I. If you enjoyed this episode and want to explore more fascinating historical topics, make sure to subscribe to us at rdspc.net.
And don't forget to share this episode with anyone who might be interested in learning more about the real story behind the Great War.
Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.